All right. Well, welcome everyone to the Housing Justice in California breakout session for the California Progressive Alliance. Thank you all so much for joining us. My name is Jane Kim. I serve as a senior advisor for Build Affordable Faster California, the logo behind me. We are a statewide project working on affordable housing advocacy, as well as progressive revenue advocacy in the state of California, and also providing technical assistance around land use and affordable housing around the state to community-based organizations and local elected officials. It is really my pleasure to be introducing this outstanding panel of folks that I have worked with in so many different capacities over the last decade, at least. First, I want to introduce Bobbi Lopez, our moderator today. She is our policy director with Build Affordable Faster California, formerly chief of staff for Oakland President City Council member Rebecca Kaplan, also was my legislative director when I served on the San Francisco Board of Supervisors, former organizer with SCIU 10 to 1, and also Tenderloin Housing Clinic, spearheaded and founded two ground-oriented programs, La Voz Latina, organizing Latina mothers in the Tenderloin, and Safe Passages, which organized community members to come together to make our streets safer for children. The second person I would like to introduce is Pedro Galvao, who is the policy director of Nonprofit Housing Organization of California, does a lot of our statewide housing work, and will certainly fill us with a ton of the data around the needs for housing and where we need to build and to preserve. Pedro also interned at my office many, many moons ago when he was a policy student, and it's just amazing to see the work that you have continued to do. Finally, our final panelist is Shanti Singh, the Communications and Legislative Director for Tenants Together, a statewide organization organizing tenants around the state around tenant protection legislation. Shanti is also my former colleague on Bernie 2020 as our Deputy Data Director. And by the way, this is, I think, our 1-year anniversary of winning the state of California for Senator Bernie Sanders. We won 46 out of 53 congressional districts. We came in first place, just showing how much more progressive California is than people realize when we have resources and when we do incredible groundwork and organizing for candidates in our agenda. And so I am now going to hand things over to Bobbi Lopez. Oh, and before that, we will have at 1 o'clock, we do have 2 of our new progressive leaders, elected leaders, that will be joining us to talk about what they're doing locally and statewide. Oakland City Councilwoman Carol Fife and California Assemblymember Alex Lee. Now handing things over to Bobbi.
Thank you, Shanti. The first role of a moderator is to make sure you are unmuted. But anyway, I really want to thank Jane for that very kind introduction to us. Hopefully you will be with us for the next hour and a half as we explore housing issues in the state of California and also hear from some of our new and amazing local leaders. Jane already went through the kind of the breakdown of what we're going to be doing today, but for about the next half hour or so, we're going to talk about local state policy. That's going to be Pedro, Shanti, and myself. Then we're going to hear from Oakland City Councilwoman Carol Fife, and then from Assembly Member Alex Lee. And then, of course, we're going to provide the public the opportunity to kind of have a back and forth question and answer period, and even just a general discussion of what's happening in the state of California. Now, before we kind of go into our conversation, I wanted to really ground us in some just what is happening around housing in California. I think we all know this because probably the folks listening to this talk are active in their communities, but obviously Californians are really feeling the burden right now of either being rent burdened or underwater with their mortgages, and also just of being unhoused. And the pandemic has only really exacerbated these existing economic inequalities. The stat that's very important for folks to know is the Golden State's homeless population is, a quarter of the unhoused people in all of the United States. Over 150,000 people experience homelessness in California every day. Also, there's many reports. California Housing Partnership has come out with one that estimates that, part of this reason is because there just isn't the affordability of housing available to unhoused folks. We estimate that shortfall to be about 1.3 million homes. And then there's something that we would say is that even for those folks who are currently housed, they're feeling very cost burdened. Now, cost burden means that you're either paying more than 30% of your income on housing and having difficulties meeting, basic necessities, or severely rent burden, meaning you're paying more than 50% of your income on rent. In California, unfortunately, this is the state where we're seeing a lot of that. And as you can see, I put a poll from that, partnership, from that poll, is that, 79% of extremely low income households are severely rent burdened, meaning that they're paying more than 50% of their money on rent. Also, just want to note, and this is something that a lot of us have talked about, is that, there's been a lot of surveys about the impact of the pandemic. The Turner Center reported that nearly, 50% of households in California have lost employment and income, and 1 in 5 households, that's about 20%, over 20%, indicated they had little to no confidence in their ability to pay rent or mortgage next month. And, Shanti's going to go deeper into this. We ourselves have also done polls that have aligned with these numbers. And I think it's important to also note that the Public Policy Institute of California also, it's very important to note that Latinos and African Americans in low income households are disproportionately being impacted by this inability to pay rent. As you can see in this stat right here, 23% of Latinos, 19% of African Americans, and 22% of low income households failed to pay rent in July. Again, these are things that we're going to go deeper into. And the reason we're here is because the bottom line is good policy makes a difference. When you make good policies that center impacted people, that center affordable housing and take care of tenants, you have the kind of outcomes that we want to see. Now, this is something that we might talk about later, but, the rent moratorium, really clearly stated that, there were studies done on what happens if you lifted rent moratoriums. And there was a study by a bunch of, medical professionals that indicated that lifting eviction moratoriums basically was associated with an increased COVID-19 incidence and mortality. And the stat was so clear that, there's about 433,000 cases and over 10,000 deaths that were in fact tied to lifting moratoriums. So not only is housing important because we want, good livable situations, but also because it saves lives. I'm going very fast because I really want to hear from our speakers. So as you can see here, I just wanted to make sure we were aware of some of the bills that are coming out. There are so many housing bills, so we just picked some of the ones that we're aware of right now. There are a lot of spot bills. Spot bills are bills that could become something else down the line. So there are probably going to be some other really great bills in this cycle. But this cycle really, really has a lot of housing bills that we hope a lot of folks pay attention to. I'm not going to go over the bills that are currently highlighted in green because we have some amazing speakers who are actually directly working on those bills. But I wanted to share about some of the bills that are also out there that you might want to learn more about. And we're going to do a Google form at the end of the meeting. So if some of you want to get involved with directly supporting any of these bills, we can make that connect and support that work. Some of the bills in the state legislature include AB 328 by Assemblymember Chu out of San Francisco, Cowra, and Wicks. And this is a really fundamentally great program about really providing housing for those who are formerly incarcerated and really kind of disrupting that prison to homelessness pipeline that we're seeing out there. And part of it is really about closing some of our prisons to fund reentry housing. So it's a fantastic bill. I hope folks take a look at it. There's also AB 491 from Assembly Member Lorena Gonzalez. And this is ensuring that mixed income buildings treat all residents fairly in terms of amenities. This is something that we have definitely had to deal with in San Francisco. I know Jane has stories. I myself also have stories where, you have situations where, where a developer comes in and they want to build separate entrances for the low income folks that are part of the building. There was a case in San Diego that got a lot of attention where the market rate units in the building could have access to the pool and the gym, but not the folks that were low income. So it's really making sure that all amenities, all entrances, all common spaces are equally accessible to both low income and market rate units that are in a development project. AB 528, I know it's still being developed, so we're excited to hear more about that. But I know a lot of folks in Oakland are really excited about this bill. Specifically to figure out, how to make sure that tax delinquent properties don't end up with, speculators, and how do we keep those into our community. And so this bill is still being developed, but it's very exciting and I would keep an eye on it. AB 672 is the sale of publicly owned and underutilized golf courses for open space and affordable housing. God knows we have a really big golf course in San Francisco, so definitely gets you wondering if there are better ways to use our space that we currently have. AB 946, this was introduced last cycle. It's really ending a tax break on second homes, vacation homes, and that's going to be Assembly Member Lee, who's going to be joining us later. AB 978 is also another bill that was introduced last year but didn't pass, but hoping we can make it pass this year, which is really talking about, you know, rent increases and limiting rent increases on mobile parks. And, you know, maybe Shanti, no pressure, Shanti, you might have a million other things you're going to talk about, but it might be worth mentioning. AB 1188 rental registry is something that was also introduced last cycle that didn't make it through, but we're hoping makes it through this cycle, which is really requiring cities and counties to create rental registries online so that the public can receive specific information on landlords that own 5 or more properties. So the last 3 I just want to quickly mention is we have SB 5, which is currently a spot bill, but it's going to be likely a statewide housing bond for low-income housing. And I believe it's looking to be put on the November 22nd, 2022 ballot. But again, it's still in process as well. SCA 2 is something that has gotten a lot of attention about repealing Article 34 from the California Constitution, which would require a vote of people for publicly funded affordable housing projects. And then one thing that I'm super excited about, I'm just going to be honest, is ACA 1, which lowers the voter threshold for affordable housing measures to 55%. And this is something that in some communities where folks are not supportive of affordable housing, it can really make sure that the majority of folks want to move forward a project, but not that it's such that, you know, folks that want to create exclusionary communities then have this control. So I think I've done enough talking. So I really want to kind of hand it over to, we're going to hear from Pedro first and then from Shanti about some of the work they're doing statewide.
And thank you so much for having me here today, Bobbi, and thank you, Jane, for that really kind introduction. So just going to jump right into it. One of the bills that we think will be a game changer if we get it passed this year is AB 71. And as you all know, California is facing a housing emergency with 151,000 people who are unsheltered on any given night. And our homelessness crisis is particularly harsh on Black Californians, people of color, Indigenous Californians who are overly represented. And we have a bill, NPH is working on a bill with our partners, Housing California, California Corporation for Supportive Housing, that would raise taxes on corporations to the tune of $2.4 billion a year in order to pay for housing and services for people experiencing homelessness. There are 2 technical ways that it raises taxes. One is around just the overall corporate tax rate. It increases it by 1.2%. And the other way is a tax on income made abroad for corporations that do business in California. We think that if this bill were to pass, it would make a fundamental difference, and that right now, we don't have a major funding source to fund housing and services for people experiencing homelessness year over year. It's many one-time investments. And so we get this system that, you know, one year might be great, another year might be terrible. And this is a way to make a long-term investment to make systemic change. Within 5 years of getting this bill through, we estimate that we could bring inside 75% of the people experiencing homelessness who are unsheltered in California. It's also geared to directly address racial disparities in homelessness by measuring who's benefiting from these programs and targeting programs specifically to Black Californians, Indigenous Californians, and people of color who are disproportionately represented among people experiencing homelessness. So we really hope to get your strong support behind this bill. And Bobbi, I think I'm kicking it over to you for the next one. Oh, you're on mute.
So just real quickly, I also wanted to mention another bill that I myself am working on. And this is, you know, this is an interesting bill in the sense that it is something that started only back in 2014 which is basically the creation of something called EIFD, Enhanced Infrastructure Financing Districts. And it's something that really has not been used. I think there's less than maybe half a dozen different cities or projects that have started using these. And really, it hasn't been for affordable housing. And so, but it's something in the tool that we can actually do in the toolbox that can be used for purposes. So it's a type of financing mechanism that we could really adapt to create more affordable housing. And what we're trying to do with this bill is actually allow more flexibility for affordable housing providers to use this bill, but also in addition to ensure that this bill can now be used for small business and in specific for social services like homelessness. But anyway, I want to kind of move forward because I know that we still want to hear from Shanti, who has many amazing things to share with us.
Am I up already?
You are.
All right. All right. You want to put up the slides? We can talk about 1199 first, I guess. Thanks. So hi, I'll introduce myself in the meantime again. My name is Shanti Singh. I am personally based in San Francisco, but I am the Communications and Legislative Director for Tenants Together, which is a statewide coalition of, I think we're at 50 now, organizations that are renters' rights organizations, tenant unions, legal aid, community organizations, primarily rooted, of course, in Black, Indigenous, Latino, and other communities of color. So yeah, I'm very excited to be here and to talk about AB 1199, which is the first thing I'm going to talk about, which is the Corporate Monopoly Transparency and Excise Tax. It's a corporate landlord tax, which I think a lot of folks, a lot of progressives have been talking about doing for a really, really long time, and I'm really excited to get moving on it. It's got a broad coalition of supporters right now. It started with the California Reinvestment Coalition and with the Housing Rights Committee of San Francisco, but ACE, Tenants Together, hopefully soon Housing Now, and a lot of other folks are going to be coming on board and really like rooting this coalition. So what the bill really does two things. One, it creates transparency and reporting requirements for all these LLCs, LPs, shadowy kind of institutions that own housing, right? And so as a lot of folks know, corporate housing ownership tends to be really hard to find. Sometimes you don't even know who your landlord is because, you know, it's owned by some entity with a generic name that's owned by another entity with a generic name that's owned by a third entity with a generic name. And it's really, really hard to keep track. So, you know, in 1991, the census said that 92% of rental properties were owned by named individuals. So in the 1991, 92% of the time, you could know who your landlord really was. But according to the Treasury Department today, all cash transactions, which are often made by shell companies, they're now 1 in 4 residential purchases across the country. So 1 in 4 purchases are all cash and are sometimes made by these corporations where you don't really know who's buying it. You don't know who's on the other side of that corporate name. So this would bring a lot of transparency and accountability to that. Particularly, you know, that's something that's been accelerating since the 2008 crisis, when you saw this wave of foreclosures that again disproportionately hurt Black and Brown communities. And you saw, you know, a rise in corporate rentals and consolidation of housing stock by these actors who tend to be very not great landlords, let's say that. So it increases the reporting requirements for these limited liability companies and limited partnerships. It requires the Secretary of State to actually create a database where any member of the public can actually go and search that database and see how these entities work, how they're networked, who owns what. But, you know, I think the most exciting part for us too is that it's going to use that information and then impose a tax, and the percentage hasn't been determined yet. But, you know, that's going to be something that's subject to negotiation, that we're going to be fighting pretty hard on that. But if you're a larger landlord, so not, you know, a true mom and pop is exempted. You have to rent out 10 or more properties in order to be subject to this legislation. You will be taxed a certain amount, and that tax on your gross receipts, and that tax will go to funding rent relief, legal services for tenants, hopefully maybe even affordable housing, lots and lots of good stuff that we all need to stabilize California renters in the pandemic and beyond. So we're really excited to keep pushing on that. And we're just kind of getting the coalition going. So if people are really interested in getting involved, if you're representing an organization and you haven't signed on yet, or you'd like more information, feel free to shoot me an email at Shanti, SHANTI @tenantstogether.org. The other thing that I wanted to talk about real quick was the Keep Families Housed campaign. So this is kind of, I guess it's a super group, if you will. Us at Tenants Together and our coalition, our friends and close allies at Housing Now, which is another large coalition of housing justice groups and labor. We're kind of putting our heads together and also working with, progressive policy groups across California, and allies in labor to build this coalition in order to continue pushing for change for debt relief and eviction protections during the pandemic. So, for a quick background, there have been eviction protections in place since August. There was Assembly Bill 3088, then there was Senate Bill 91. We have been fighting really hard through this whole time to get our necessary fixes to really critical loopholes in the bill, to have a rent relief program that actually works for tenants. I'll be fully upfront, and I think we're among friends here, we're among progressives here. We did not get everything that we wanted, and there's a lot of fixes that still need to be made. There are a lot of people who are also just, again, as Bobbi was talking about the eviction stats, who are disproportionately Black and Latino, who are falling through the cracks right now because we have yet to pass something comprehensive enough at the state legislature to protect them. So this campaign, even though something just passed, even the legislation just passed, we're still going, right? We're certainly not going to stop, but it's very much far from over. And as we kind of now are in this transitional phase, where we have protections expiring in June again, so we have to have this fight again. We have to extending them through and beyond June, hopefully to the end of the year. But we also need to talk about rent relief. We need to make sure that we're holding the legislature and the governor accountable for people's difficulties, as they're going to have difficulties accessing rent relief, landlord harassment, rent hikes, all of the issues that they have and continue to deal with. So the Keep Families Housed coalition is, to house those immediate policy needs, but also, to bring the concerns up from the base and from the ground, and also to push for the long-term, cancellation and relief of debt. And that's something that, we're also going to be working hopefully with Utility Justice and other coalitions, and bringing that on board as part of a grant effort to kind of make sure that no California renter is saddled with crippling debt for years to come. So if you're also interested in that, definitely hit me up. But it is I do like comparing it to a rock supergroup, because like the band's all together and we're pushing forward. So
thank you, Shanti. Well, I just want to take a pause here right now. I see there's a lot of questions from community, so we will get back to those around 1:30. And actually, Pedro has one more bill to share with the group that I think is really great. But right now we have some special guests, so we want to create the space for our special folks that came. I think many of you are familiar with Carol Fife, who's just an amazing woman, legislator, activist, nonprofit director, organizer for decades, who did a lot of work with ACE and also with Moms for Housing movement, and who we were very lucky that is now an elected representative at the city of Oakland. And so, council member, we've been talking a little bit about just, what's happening at the state level. We'd love for really to give you the floor to kind of talk about anything you might be working on or things that you'd like the kind of progressive community to think about. So it's very open-ended in terms of what you'd love to talk about. And welcome.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here. There's so much that we need to be focused on right now, but how much time do I have? Because I don't want to go off on too much of a
You have 15 minutes.
What? 15 minutes? Well, then we can talk about everything. Talk about everything. Right now, the city of Oakland is facing a budget shortfall. And if you listen to the popularity that's going through mainstream media, you would think that it's because of COVID. And while that is true, there are a lot of things that are happening and that are not being highlighted as the real reason that we are in a budget crisis. So my name is Carol Fife. Bobbi recently introduced me in my work at Moms for Housing, but I'm also a part of a coalition of grassroots organizers who've been fighting for reform the police budgets for many, many years. And so I'm a part of the Refund Oakland Community and Labor Coalition, which also home the defund program. Well, it's not a program, the defund campaign, which is a project of the Anti-Prayer Project. And so they have been talking for years about the overspending that is of the police department in the city of Oakland not staying within budget every single year. So right now it's really on everybody's minds is safety, and how are we going to actually create public safety with a different alternative other than police department completely just obliterates their budget every single fiscal year. Last year it was by 32 million. We were by 32 million. The year before that, it was 15 million. So some policies that are being put in front of the city council now are ways to look at reimagining public safety through a lens that is not the police department. Not just because of the harm it causes to communities, or specifically African Americans and Black people in the city of Oakland, as we've seen through countless studies, reports, lawsuits, scandals, but also just because it's just fiscally unsustainable. It is completely unsustainable. And had we not had the overtime spending that we had with this recent budget, then COVID would not impact the city of Oakland in the way that it is. So we've got to remember and understand that. So we have some budget recommendations and some reimagining task force ideas that have come forward that will be presented to the city council very soon. And so I'm excited at the role that Oakland is going to play. And this conversation is taking place throughout the country right now. That Oakland once again is the epicenter of revolutionary activity through how we look at our spending and how we look at relationships of power with the people. We saw that it's starting to happen in the Peralta colleges. It's happening in the school boards, in all the different public schools in Oakland. So that's one of the things that is really important and critical in the times we're living in right now. So I had to look that up. But in terms of legislation, one of the things that I'll be working on really soon with my council colleagues is the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act. So that is a policy that has been in the works for the last years, but has never really been able to get off the ground, partly because of the opposition that landlord lobby is putting into opposing what is really in the best interest of renters and working class and low-income people in the city of Oakland who are at risk of displacement where landlord or property owner wants to sell their home. So you can have a tenant that been living in the same place for many years, and because of our current market structure, and like want to get the most money they possibly can, and they will up and sell your home they've been living in, paying rent or paying the mortgage for, or in most cases, and just put you out on the street. And we've seen the impact that can have on families, and is a violent impact. I want to be clear that public safety is not just around policing and fire safety. It's all safety of knowing that you have a secure place to live. So right now we're in the budget fights, but soon, and in parallel with that timeline, we've got to pass legislation that protects tenants from being able to be just put out on the streets. In ways we're going to do that is the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act, which will give the first right of refusal to individual tenants or potentially nonprofit organizations to come in and purchase the home, so that before it goes on the market, so that tenants can have the opportunity to continue to live securely where they live. And I heard the speaker that was talking about rent protections, particularly in the face of pending evictions in the moratorium of the country and throughout the state of California. So we will also be looking for ways to continue to protect tenants and to protect all landlords who may be at risk of losing their homes foreclosure, because we cannot have a repeat of 2008 and the previous financial crisis. And then there are several reports that point to the fact that coronavirus lasted so long, has had a more immediate impact than the previous financial crisis that we're facing in the near future can be ridiculously worse what we experienced in 2008. So we've got to prepare for that. We've seen that our safety systems don't exist or have been completely fractured. So many different spaces around education, public education, healthcare, our job and economic prospects, because so many of our people that we love and care about and advocate for have been in precarious employment situations in any way, without real healthcare plans, or gig workers, or frontline workers without many protections. So we've got to figure out legislatively and through grassroots organizing how we keep each other safe. We are living in critical times, but they're beautiful. And we're going to hear more about this later with the next speaker, but we've got to look at social housing as a solution to the housing conditions that we're currently experiencing. I talked about TOPA. We need one of the things I'm also be working on is inclusion zoning. So developments that are particularly happening in my district in the city of Oakland are more equitable, because the dearth of development that is happening is not where it needs to be. We don't need more market rate housing. And I'm sorry for all the YIMBYs that I may be hurting feelings or stepping on their toe, but the housing that we need is for people who are already and who have been struggling with the ridiculous rents that plague the area. So we need to see some ways that we're supporting those people that don't make 80% of the area median income. And Moms for Housing was that baby. The individuals that were active in lifting up the housing conditions in Oakland were Black women who were born and raised in the city, who could not afford to live here, who had to live in cars and hotels and shelters and spaces because the rents are too damn high. So if the rents are too high, the average working class person in the city, and that home purchases are just completely out of reach. Why is that? So those are some of the legislative things that I'm going to be working on locally and statewide, in coalition with many of the people that are on this call today, but also some federal legislation, a social housing development entity that can help buy distressed properties and create social housing throughout the country. Those are just things, and I'm rushing to try to get everything in. Some things that I can't say because I feel like the things that I try to do are often coded or unsigned before they even get in. So I'm careful not to tell all the details and spill all the beans. Just know that, as I'm sure you all do, the systems currently encompass what we know to the norm not working. They are not working. And it'll take building from the base, build from the bottom up, actually create change to these things. And we've got to understand that might not be normal, it might not be acceptable, but that is the beauty of this movement with the mindset. Every day, working women decided to change the narrative about who deserves housing in the city of Oakland. Created an internationally known movement around how to do the impossible. And that is what we all need to be trying to figure out how to do in every single sector where we are. We've got to figure out how we do the impossible and catch out any doubt that the things that we thought were working could possibly work. So I'm just leave it there because I feel like I'm talking much. We got to work out for us. But I'm excited about the future.
We appreciate all that you were saying. I just want to note that your sound is coming in a little bit choppy, but I think we captured a lot of what we heard. I did want to share that Robert Copland out of Sacramento, I believe he's with the Eviction Defense Network over there, just wanted to say that what is happening in Oakland is also happening in Sacramento. The police budget always seems to be up. and social service organizations always have to fight for what they need. So your words are resonating across the state.
Thank you, Bobbi.
And then just a quick question, because I know that some of the interest is also the local work that's happening with TOPA. And then I think you also mentioned inclusion. And I'm curious to hear a little bit about that, because, you know, one of the things that I noticed before you came to your district, there was a project at West Oakland Park, over 1,000 units, and only 7% of that in the heart of working class Oakland, and only 7% of that was affordable. 92% of that was market rate condos. So just really appreciate that you're here. And then another question for you from the public is, you know, any plans to get more folks like Carol and Katie? You know, what do we need to do to get, you know, our councils to look more like folks in the movement?
I am definitely working with a group of women who are trying to amplify that work here in Oakland, and working with people who are born and raised from the city who actually want to make a change, because, you know, they've said to me, like, all of these things have happened because of people who were born and raised here. And I try to respect the offices that people hold, but the mayor of Oakland was born and raised in Oakland, and has done more to exemplify what leadership should not be for the city. From the recent Chinatown press conference with our council president, Nikki Fortunato Bad, the recent rally at Lake Merritt, and basically all white rally, condemn teachers and our teachers unions. It's just like so many things that I could point to about being more than born here, because some of the people born here are doing some worst work. So we want to get people who are born and raised from the city who should actually live it, and we see progressive change, and working to get that bench so that we can have more kills. Because for one, I don't be here. I don't want to be the only one. I want it to be a multitude, a chorus of individuals looking for progressive change and transformation. So we're definitely working on that. And I hope to work with the coalition that I'm in partnership now to amplify that.
Thank you, council member, and thank you so much for your time. I know we just also had another guest joined us that Jane was going to also introduce. Jane?
Great.
Lost Jane. Oh, hi, Jane.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Councilwoman Fife, for just inspiring all of us and showing us that we can have elected leaders from the ground who have done organizing work to make change. And with you, you'll pull up so many others to lead for Oakland. I'm really excited now to introduce another newly elected member here in California, the youngest member ever to be elected to the California State Legislature, also a DSA member and another strong Bernie 2020 supporter, along with Councilman Fife, a California Assembly member, Alex Lee. Alex has already stirred up a huge storm in Sacramento in his 2 months of being elected, has introduced a flurry of progressive legislation, really a dream agenda for our progressive movement here in California. And we'll be speaking to a few of the bills that he's introduced, a few of many, many, that we hope that folks will really organize around. And I think, you know, before I let Assemblymember Lee speak about social housing and a number of other bills that we've asked him to speak about, to just really emphasize how important it is that we continue to organize. We can't just elect Carol Fifes and Alex Lee and then hope that all the change happens. We have to continue to organize, and we have to understand that Alex is one of 120 members of the state legislature. So we have a lot of work to do to get a majority, or in some case, a 2/3, to pass some of the bills that he has introduced. So electing Alex is the first step, but then we have to be with him every step of the way and continue to organize. speak to our elected representatives in the state legislature to make sure they are supporting the agenda that we want to see for Californians. So Assemblymember Alex Lee, thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much, Jane, for the warm introduction. Thank you. Really glad to join you all. I actually just hopped on from a different breakout room. I was in the electoral reform working group just now, and we're talking about all the great things we need to do to change up our electoral system to make it fairer and more inclusive of working class Californians. But today, on this one, I want to talk about some of the ambitious housing agenda we have. But I, of course, would be remiss if I didn't mention that on that call, I was talking about Assembly Bill 20, which bans all corporations from donating to any candidate in California. And that's why it's so important to get the housing goals, the healthcare goals, the education goals we want, because entrenched corporate social interests, at the end of the day, are still huge impediments to the progress we want. But so, of course, of talking about some of the progress that we want, I've been really happy to introduce in my first, 3 months, I guess. Yeah, 3 months in office, introduce a couple of different bills. One bill I'm really, really excited to talk about is the Social Housing Act. And the Social Housing Act is simply this, is to make sure that we have a transformative tool to address our housing crisis that is publicly led. Social housing, in a nutshell, is essentially publicly owned and developed and maintained housing that is not completely controlled by the for-profit market. That is where we are right now in California, where we lean very hard on the for-profit market. And look, I personally believe there's a place for these things, but we can't put all our eggs in that basket. If we truly want to address our housing affordability crisis, we can't keep feeding into the cycles and systems that have perpetuated and created it. So social housing is really important. It's important, obviously, because there have been programs or policies, I should say, that are very successful in countries like Singapore or in countries like Austria, with Red Vienna, that have social housing programs that have been successful and older than even our public housing infrastructure in this country. And they're successful because they made deliberate choices to continue to make those inclusive of everyone in those areas, to be able to afford housing as their human right, as a government guarantee. And this country, unfortunately, and what we have to learn is to not repeat those mistakes, to warehouse support, not to turn them into new segregation areas, or to really warden it off so that it's actually, it makes the quality of life for folks worse. We don't want to repeat those things, but luckily, at least the silver lining is we can learn from those mistakes of the past. And I'm really committed to working on this bill. Oh, the bill number is 387 right now. It's Assembly Bill 387. It's quite sparse right now, but that's on purpose too. I intend this to be a long process, hopefully not too long, of course, but a long process where it's deliberative, and we're inviting housing justice folks, housing advocates, tenant groups to be at the table and craft the policy together. Because a lot of the times in Sacramento, and I've known this too, is we create a grand vision, people create grand visions, and then we allow working communities to react to them, right? That's not the style I want to have in this one. I want to really have a deliberative process, especially that includes the tenant justice groups, to be included in this and build a proposal from the ground up, because I think that will make us the strongest sense, because we truly want this to be a collective vision, not just in the sense of the bill, but collective sense of how we manage our housing crisis and how we decommodify housing in the future. And that's why it's so important to be doing that work for social housing. Now, quickly also mention just other things we're working on in the housing space. We're going to be working on an Ellis Act reform bill, which makes it so it's harder for-profit speculators to flip properties and kick out people, especially on rent-controlled units. We also have a bill to generate $250 million for new home ownership opportunities by taking a tax subsidy away from people who have second homes. I think one is good enough for the time being, and let's allow more people, especially people of color, to access funds for new home ownership and build generational wealth. And I'm also very happy to be co-authoring AB 71 by Assemblymember Rivas, which is going to raise the corporate tax to provide funding for homelessness programs. So that was really important. And housing is definitely going to always be one of the issues I care really deeply about, and something I'm passionate about personally. My district is in the Bay Area, in the South and East Bay, and anyone who lives in the Bay Area knows it's way too expensive to afford to live there. And even personally for me, I only live in the Bay Area because I get to live with my family. I have the privilege of them not kicking me out yet, so I can stay in the Bay Area. But I'm really excited to be working with everyone on here, and if there's questions, I guess I'll stick around to do questions, Q&A.
Yeah, so if audience members have any questions, please post them, and Helen will put them up on our chat. Assembly member, before we address some of the audience questions, I think I'd love for you, you're in Sacramento, your colleagues. How can, folks that are attending this convention really support this agenda to move forward? Because we know that many of the bills, in particular ones that you've introduced, have a really uphill battle, not because they're not popular with voters. In fact, in our polls, we've seen that many of the issues that you have introduced are very popular with voters because we know we need it, but are not as popular with our elected officials. And so what are some ways that we can support building a progressive agenda in Sacramento?
Absolutely. It's a fantastic question, Jane. And the easiest answer to say is make your opinion heard. Make it heard. It is, of course, these programs and these policy ideas are popular in a common sense to people in California. But if you're not making your voice heard to our legislators, they're not going to think it's popular that way. The unfortunate reality is there's a lot of high-paid lobbyists out there in Sacramento who are paid a lot of money to get in our face all the time and really present us facts and evidence and stuff like that. But it's really important. It's a little cheesy, I know, but call, write your representative, but do it frequently. That's the important part. Do it frequently. Make sure that that they know you're seriously engaged in it. Because if they turn around and say, "Oh my God, a bunch of people actually really care about social housing or tenants' rights in my district," and they're really mobilizing, they will care and they'll pay attention to that. Because it's so important to do that. Either you're comfortable doing it as a call, email, letter writing, social media. Getting their attention is really important. I pay attention personally to it. I actually signed a response letter on some criminal justice things that people wrote to me, and I always pay attention to these things. I know our legislators genuinely care because they want to know what's happening in the district. And if you all mobilize in your communities and let them know that you care about housing justice, let it be known.
And, I know you worked in Sacramento before you were elected, so this isn't a new space for you. But I would ask, in your first 2 months, what has surprised you? And what do you see as some silver linings or strengths of the progressive movement now that you've seen build over the last few years, if any?
Yeah, it's a good question. Surprise, I guess in a pleasant way, there are a lot of legislators who are really fed up with the status quo system. That's why we do have actually, even though I think the detractors would say I'm far out there, I'm radical, whatever, all our bills have a lot of co-authors on them because these are common sense ideas with the people of California. So I've been very pleasantly surprised that I'm not going to be alone in the fight. And, hopefully we will have more and more people coming to these ideas and coming around to them more naturally. So it'll be good that way. But I've been pleasantly surprised that way. And sorry, what was your second question? What was the second part?
I guess silver linings or strengths that you've seen the progressive movement build over the last few years in California, but in particular in Sacramento.
Yeah, the strength is all our collective organizing is really paying off. It's getting stronger and stronger with the advocacy groups, with community groups, and then also internally in the legislature. I think the term progressive is finally being more solidified and concrete and based on those ideals. We have a progressive legislative caucus now, and it's really awesome. So we're going to hopefully make a lot of wins out of that. Another great thing about the progressive movement is, as we said, it is popular and it is common sense amongst the California people. So ultimately, politicians, right, if those that care more about what the polling says, they'll also go that way because they have to stay in office. But it'll be good. I think we were going to gain a lot of momentum. And finally, in California, with our Democratic supermajorities and control of every part of the state government, I think we'll ultimately be able to unlock that potential.
So we have just a few minutes left before we open up to a larger discussion. Alex, this isn't related just to housing, but you did talk about AB 71. Do you think you could give this group a small peek, a sneak preview of the California wealth tax?
Oh, I would love to.
I only ask because Build Affordable Faster is one of the sponsoring organizations, and we're really excited about this for numerous reasons, but we know that we can't build housing without more revenue. So
Absolutely. Well, I am very happy to be talking about the California tax on extreme wealth that we will be unveiling very shortly. It is going to be really important because right now, as we know, there's way too much concentration of wealth at the tippy top. If folks are familiar with Elizabeth Warren's plan to tax 2% of multimillionaires, we're doing a very, very similar thing. What we're doing is folks who have been very blessed, right, to have $50 million or more in assets, we're asking them to tax 1%, 1 cent on every dollar over your 50 million assets. So when you get up to 49.99 millionaire, you're fine. You won't be touched by this. It's lucky for you. But even that, this tax rate in California alone would only affect 0.07% of the wealthiest folks in California. That's the top 1% of the top 1%. And that has the potential to get California $22 billion, 22 billion, it's going to be, in new investments in California. And that can go towards our housing, our healthcare, our schools, things that we know we need to reinvest in. So really excited to be working with a giant coalition on this and making sure that the wealthy are paying their fair share. Because as we know, especially during this COVID time where the poor are getting way, way poorer and the rich are getting way, way, way richer, it's time for them to be paying their fair share and making sure that those wealthy, ultra wealthy folks in California are paying their fair share and making California, making real tangible investments in California, in the state that made them successful. So really happy to be rolling that out and unlocking the potential in everything we can do with that. It's a lot of money, $22 billion.
It's a lot of money, Assemblymember Lee, and we are so excited that you'll be championing this social housing, reforming the Ellis Act, and so many other bills that we're so lucky to see you introduce. And just a reminder to everyone listening, we have a lot of work ahead of us this year to pass this agenda. And just really excited that we have two elected officials that we really believe in, that have come from the ground, come from our communities of color, our immigrant communities, our LGBT communities, our DSA community. It's just so exciting to have both of you there. So I'm going to hand things back to our moderator, Bobbi Lopez. Thank you again, Assemblymember Lee and City Councilwoman Fife.
Yes, thank you so much. And thank you for all the work you're doing. We're getting quite a few questions from the public, so feel free to stay on or to leave, no pressure, because we only asked you to be here for a little bit of time, but it's up to you. Before we go to the questions, we did have an opportunity to talk about one more bill that one of our panelists is working on. So I wanted to bring back Pedro to kind of just let us know a little bit about one last bill that's very exciting. And I'm going to put it up on our screen if you give me 1 second.
Great. Thank you so much, Bobbi, for the opportunity, and I won't take up too much time. So NPH, alongside with East Bay Housing Organizations and the Public Interest Law Project, we're working on a bill that will strengthen the state's commitment to use public land for the public good. It's called AB 1271, and what it would do is whenever a public agency is redeveloping a large site like a military base or hundreds of acres of land that they own, to essentially establish minimum affordability requirements for building on that land so that it doesn't all go to market rate development without any affordability attached to it, or a hotel, or many other uses that don't actually prioritize greater affordability for Californians. The other thing that this bill does is many public agencies, they don't actually sell their land, they lease them for the long term. And so you have leases that are 75 years, 99 years, which are in effect a sale. And right now, when you do a long-term lease and you build housing on it, there aren't clear rules for providing affordability. And so what this bill would do is it would actually require long-term leases to be covered under the Surplus Lands Act as well. So if a public agency is no longer using that land for whatever reason it got it for, and then goes out and leases it for the long term, we want to make sure that there's affordability attached to that as well. So that's it on AB 1271. I'm happy to answer questions. Thanks, Bobbi, for the opportunity.
Thank you so much. We're going to start taking questions from the public, and I think anyone who's still here who feels comfortable answering something. A lot of these questions are actually about bills that we may not be directly working on, so I think it's more like, are we aware of? But the first question I think we can get, which the question is, does the wealth tax have a bill number yet? And that question is from David.
The wealth tax does not have a bill number yet, but it will be a constitutional amendment, and you'll be seeing that soon. I can't give you a number only because it's like the bureaucratic drafting process, and the bill is literally so long that it's taking them so long to write it. And it's long because I did not know this, but there's a lot of ways rich people try to hide their money away, and we're building in provisions to make sure they can't evade, they can't tax evade. So no number yet, but keep an eye out.
Thank you, Assembly Member. Then we have a question from Adam K, who wants to know if there's any plans right now to take on Costa-Hawkins.
Who should that vote for?
Shanti, do you want to maybe start, and then maybe you, Assembly Member? Would that be okay?
Yeah. Right now, no, but that doesn't mean that that's only because we just did it. You know, the fight against, like, we're never not fighting against Costa-Hawkins. So, or looking at whatever legislative, ballot, et cetera, vehicle that we can possibly find. Obviously, with Prop 10 and Prop 21, we worked very, very hard, and we did not get what we needed to get out of that. But in terms of where our focus is now, I mean, at least as the, you know, speaking for tenant organizations and the advocacy that we're doing, obviously there's a ton of bills that we're working on that we all just talked about. And there's the Ellis bill, which I know somebody just mentioned too. But, you know, we have been really, really focused on pandemic protections right now and rent relief program and loopholes and things like that. I don't see like a ton of appetite, and that's not knocking anybody. It's certainly not knocking Assembly Member Lee, who has put an enormous amount on his docket for his first year. But you know, I think like this is probably not, this year is probably not the year where we're going to see an attempt to reform or repeal Costa-Hawkins in the state legislature. You know, we'll see what really our priorities are at the ballot next year. There's a lot at the ballot that there's a lot of things that happened in the ballot last year that we might need to fix in 2022 and figure out as progressives like what we're going to prioritize. But I can tell you that, you know, the local fight that Tenants Together has always been having, and something that we're also gearing up very much to support once again. And this is something that, you know, Council Member Fife was leading the charge on, you know, before it became cool again, is local rent control measures and local just cause measures and local tenant protections. Because at the end of the day, like most of what I had to talk to state legislators. It's a blessing and a curse. Again, no offense. But I always love talking to Assembly Member Lee's office. But you know, most of what Tenants Together is doing is a lot of that local base building work and supporting, you know, our existing members are supporting the formation of new tenant organizations and stuff in places where there isn't really a lot of infrastructure. And one of the parts of that is supporting local rent control and local just cause ballot measures, and, you know, or pressuring city councils to pass those on the local level. Obviously that's constrained by Costa-Hawkins, but there's still a lot you can do. And so as a movement, I mean, we really started, and that was something again that Councilmember Fife was a huge part of, especially with her work with ACE, our friends at ACE, in terms of getting that momentum going, with Richmond and Mountain View being the first municipalities to pass local rent control. I think at that point it had been 30 years. Right. And since then, every single year since then, which was like 2015, 2016, we've seen an explosion in interested organizations in municipalities across California wanting to have that ballot fight, sometimes having that ballot fight, sometimes losing the first time, sometimes winning the first time, winning the second time, and kind of like seeing that momentum. And that momentum has not been really, you know, it was somewhat blunted by the pandemic, but it's coming back and it's continuing to grow. And that's only because of the realities of gathering signatures and all of that stuff. But, you know, now we're kind of looking ahead to 2022 and saying we can still, regardless of what the appetite is for doing another state level crack at Costa-Hawkins, to actually build on the local level more cities with rent control, more cities with tenant organizations, so that when we do go to the ballot to state level, or we do push at the state legislature once more, we're going to have an even broader base. That's not just, you know, like we got a lot of anti-Costa-Hawkins, pro-renter momentum in the Bay. We got a lot of that in LA, but we need to, like, we're still focused on growing the movement so that when we do something statewide, we have a base in every municipality in California where we can get that passed and we can get that done. So I know that's not the most satisfying answer, but that's kind of how we're thinking about it right now.
Assembly Member, would you like to just add anything to what Shanti just mentioned? I know that you've also been thinking about this as well.
Yeah, well, I would say Shanti's right on the money. We have to keep building that coalition. We have to keep engaging in the fight, and always knowing that, you know, losing the fight is a possibility, but we know in our organizing of politics, losing is not the end, right? And a lot of politics, people see it. It frustrates me sometimes. A lot of people in establishment politics see everything as like almost gambling. Like you have to gamble on the winning horse all the time, or else it's not worth gambling at all. but we're about shifting the realm of possibility, what is possible. And I've always very publicly said I want to delete Costa-Hawkins straight up. But one day I think we'll have more and more legislators up there who will see this as a common sense, and I will have a lighter bill load, so I don't have to do so many at once. But we'll get it done. I think the tide will turn in our favor soon enough, and I think we just have to keep going at it, keep educating, and keep organizing.
Thank you for saying that. I think that having worked with former Supervisor Jane Kim, I think that's something that was a lesson that I had learned, right? That sometimes you don't win the first time, but you got to come back and back and back and back. And also build a wider net of who's in your coalition at times, right? But really some ideas, it just takes a while for them to actually get there. I mean, or we wouldn't have had minimum wage or free city college, right? Those were things that are now part of the imagination, are natural and make sense. But, 10 years ago, that was not the case. So I really appreciate all that you're doing. Now we have quite a few more questions, so let me see if we can get through all of them. Rohin Gush would like to know a little bit more about AB 854. So I don't know how much you're at liberty to share about the Ellis bill, but there are some folks prying. So
sure. I mean, I'll just share very brief about the Ellis Act because that one is still being drafted as well. Ellis, fun facts, my second least favorite bill or act named after some more white people. Essentially what we're going to do is make it so that you cannot immediately, if you are a speculator, a property speculator, cannot immediately go buy a property that's full of tenants and then flip it on the market like that. That's what happens in LA. That's what happens in the Bay Area right now. We're going to make it so that you cannot just flip properties willy-nilly like that. And we're going to put a waiting period in there, and we're going to put reforms, common sense reforms in there.
Great. Any other thoughts? Now we're going to move on to the next question, which is from Robert from Sacramento, who actually has a couple questions. So let's see if we can get all your questions answered, Robert. The first question is, do we know of any plans to tax landlords that have vacant properties? I know there's been a lot of work at regional and city levels, but do we know of any sort of statewide efforts on this?
Right now, no, for this year, I can't think of anything, although maybe I'm missing something. But I think the way that we're kind of doing it with the corporate landlord tax with AB 1199, I think the idea that providing additional transparency for these corporate actors in particular, I think that is going to inform our ability to take further action on vacancies, because it is a lot of the corporate actors who tend to, the economics of it, I guess, for them, but it is a lot of these corporate actors, kind of like the ones that Moms for Housing have been fighting, for example, that tend to have these big portfolios where they can leave a lot of housing vacant and just have it sit there, or whereas where you have smaller landlords, they're less incentivized to do that. Like if you own a duplex, you're probably trying to get a renter for that duplex in general. So I think tackling the corporate transparency issue could lead to, I think, better legislation around vacancy, et cetera, too. But you are going to be you are going to be penalizing a lot of those actors who do tend to leave a lot of vacant housing, a lot of their housing stock vacant, and own a lot of that housing stock.
I'm not aware of any right now as well. I was personally exploring a vacancy tax, and then I was like, wealth tax might be enough work for this session. So, but that was something we're thinking about.
Thank you. And just to share for myself, my former boss, former council president Rebecca Kaplan out of Oakland, had put a vacancy parcel on the ballot. And I think folks may be aware that actually received more than 70% approval by voters. And so it took a while to kind of get it implemented. Obviously there were some thoughts around excluding, older homeowners who were, what you say, house poor. So there's a lot of thought put into that, but I have heard of other cities while working there. I know a lot of other cities reached out to us to see options. So I know regionally, there's still a lot of discussion on this issue of vacant property. I know that council member Carol Fife has worked tremendously on this issue and spotlighted the issue with Moms for Housing. But I did want to say that I know that there are quite a few local regional efforts. Okay, we're going to take a look again at the chat, see what other questions are coming out. some folks, another question that Robert Kaplan out of Sacramento had mentioned is that, there had been an effort to get rent control on the ballot, and it did fail pretty badly. And, I've spoken to folks in Santa Rosa who've also tried to get a measure. And so, some of the thoughts around rent control is that it is hard in some municipalities to really pass rent control. I don't know if anyone wants to sort of just address his comment. So, or we can all just be in agreement and say, yes, it's hard, but that's why there's so important to organize and to just keep on building a base. Let me see if there's any other questions. If not, I actually have a couple questions. And then also, if panelists have other questions for folks on here, feel free to ask. But one question I would love to know is, we are in the midst of a pandemic, and how has this sort of, how do you think this has kind of changed your work, working and organizing and doing policy in a pandemic? And are there things that are that, because we might be in this pattern for a couple of years. So I'm just curious to hear from folks, how has that pandemic changed organizing and your work?
I'm just gonna say I don't want to dominate the conversation all the time, so I want to offer if Pedro ever wants to speak on any issues.
Sure. That's a great question, Bobbi, and thank you, Assembly Member Lee. On the pandemic, I would say it's both really expanded what's possible, but in that, especially at the federal level, we're seeing investments at a level that we haven't seen in a very long time. And just today, the Senate approved the $1.9 trillion package, which goes I was reading would actually have childhood poverty in the United States, which is huge. I mean, thinking about just what politics looks like at the national level, and so in some regards, we're reimagining how we live. What we're reimagining these systemic issues and thinking of a better, more just future. At the same time, I've personally seen people retreat back to their corners and push against things in a way that's made the universe narrower for certain things. And so, for instance, we've all talked about, Assemblymember Lee talked about AB 71. It's a bill that my organization is strongly in support of. And I've heard from so many legislators, but corporations are fleeing California. We can't raise taxes on corporations. And it's at a time when we have 150,000 people who are unsheltered on any given night. That should be enough of a wake-up call. The fact that we have a medium-sized city's worth of people without a roof over their heads. But there's this fear that by doing something big and progressive, you're somehow going to drive away everyone. And so I think it's sort of our collective jobs to keep pushing forward a better vision, so that, and a more just vision, like Assemblymember Lee is doing with all of these bills, that can help us reorient the system. Because if, there's a lot of disaster capitalists who take advantage of times like these with pandemics and pad their profits. We need to think about, let's redesign society to make it more just during this time. And that's what we need to keep on hammering, I think, and reminding folks of, because I think as we all work, apart, it's easy to also have our mindset become a little narrower.
Any other thoughts on this one? If not, go ahead, Shanti. Looks like you wanted to say something.
Oh, no, I didn't, but I mean, I could, but I guess I could say, like, for it's about organizing in the pandemic, right? I mean, we've definitely had to be very clever, because like tenant organizing is definitely something that is best done in person. But obviously we haven't really had that option. But I think one of the things that we've done is just like we've managed to actually get really good turnout among tenants in California, really open up like all of the workshops and stuff that we do, whether it's like organizing for debt cancellation, whether it's whether it's, you know, talking like strategic stuff, whether it's counseling, right? Like teaching people to be counselors. We've done a lot of trainings to how to on illegal lockouts and community defense. And so like there's a lot of interest in it, but yeah, I guess saying Zoom is not really like the most genius answer, but I think we really broadened our training and just our reach, and we're just basically focused on let's get everybody we possibly can, right? Like let's just blast this out and see who shows up. And I think that actually works. There's a lot of interest in it, so it's just how we're handling it.
Yeah, I think actually there's a great silver lining in the era we're living in right now. In two ways. One is that traditionally, legislators and politicians surrounded by the lobbyists, and now that they don't have that access anymore, that immediate access, it's actually in some ways easier for us to organize and get to and get directly the influence to legislators and folks. In fact, I like it more because I can actually work my colleagues a lot easier without lobbyists around. So it's good in that sense, and we have to hopefully learn from this, and that and overcome the challenge of lobbyists going forward. And the second thing is like another bill I'm working on is Assembly Bill 339. That one preserves the remote and digital access options for all city council legislative hearing processes, because we know how important it is to remove these barriers for working people. And it's not something I want to see gone once the pandemic's over and they say, you know what, pandemic's over, you all got to show up at 7 p.m. city council, line up for 5 hours and make your voice heard, because that's definitely not hospitable to a lot of people. And we want to make sure it's everyone is able to make their voice heard, and not just those who have the means and resources.
So true. Well, we actually just got a few more questions. So, and one of them is an interesting question, and feel free to answer or not answer, because I want to acknowledge not everybody has thought about this. We're mostly folks that deal with tenants and affordable housing. So I know that sometimes we don't always engage in, the sort of the large production bills, because they don't always have affordable housing or sufficient amount of affordable housing. But if folks feel comfortable, and I'm happy to answer this question too, if folks feel comfortable, the question comes from Rafa, what will it take to politically get a significant large production bill like an SB 50 over the finish line? And I'll answer it, but I'll wait till other folks, if you feel comfortable answering. I know most of us are rooted more in renters' rights and affordable housing, so we haven't always looked at the by right production bills. But if folks want to answer it, I have some thoughts. I don't know if other panelists might want to talk about that one.
I can take a first stab at it if you want, Bobbi.
Go for it.
I would say it would really take a unified approach. It can't be a top-down approach. It needs to come from tenant groups, as well as market rate folks, as well as affordable folks, to come together under something that is ambitious, that doesn't place the burdens on communities that have always shouldered the burdens of development. And so, for instance, there's conversations around how can we shift some of, because California does just in general need more housing, but especially affordable housing. As Bobbi mentioned earlier, we need 1.3 million new affordable homes. And we need to do everything in our power to get to that number. Part of that is changing restrictive zoning. And last year, I worked on a bill, SB 899, that would have allowed the construction of 100% affordable housing on land owned by religious institutions, no matter what the local zoning was. And that bill actually had a lot of support, but due to just the general politics, didn't make it all the way. What we're hoping to do, and what I think is part of the solution, is the solution must come from tenant groups. It must, in partnership with those who, with YIMBYs, with market rate folks, and needs to be mindful of who we're building for and where. And I think that while these questions are not easy to answer, they are answerable. We created a horrible, complicated red line system that had some very specific answers that created, shifted burdens to low-income people of color. Now we need to reimagine something else that's more just, that can get us the numbers that we need, while not also asking for lower income communities of color to receive all the burden of development.
Anybody else want to weigh in on this question? I mean, it is a big question. It is one of the big issues being decided right now at a state level. So
I can. So yeah, I mean, I'm in total agreement with what Pedro already said. So maybe not, maybe I don't have too much new to say, but I mean, yeah, centering the impacted and also just, yeah, looking at, looking at the difference. Like, there are truly exclusionary communities that are rooted in, whose practices around land use are rooted in racism, classism, segregation. And like, I don't think there's any disagreement. I think sometimes it's presented maybe in the media or maybe sometimes even on Twitter, like there's a significant disagreement over that, but that's something that we have no disagreement on whatsoever with any of the folks who need to be part of this coalition to get something like SB 50 over the line. We're down with that. It's difficult to figure out. It's a difficult conversation to have, like in terms of like, what counts as an exclusionary community and what doesn't. Like there's a lot of geography, there's a lot of nerdy stuff that goes in there. And it's a scientific term, is nerdy stuff. But I think we need to have that dialogue because like we have to start from what we do have in common and what we can tackle together, and that knowing that, the opposition will be strong enough from those exclusionary communities that you just absolutely cannot have a fractured coalition in any way. So it's like starting from the one thing that we do all really deeply, truly share, and then, kind of working out from there. And also, I guess the other thing I'll say too is like, one of the issues is that we've always kind of dealt with is that, there's always people have a lot of good intentions. Like we all have really good intentions. But there's also been a ton of well-intentioned land use and housing policy in the past that has turned into a disaster. So just like Assemblymember Lee's kind of doing with the social housing bill with AB 387, it's like bringing groups to the table, bringing tenant groups and housing justice groups and equity groups and nonprofit housers, et cetera, to the table. Like when you start writing it, like having a big round table, even if it's going to feel messy and like it might get a little heated, but I think we're all adults. But like starting with that process, like that roundtable process, is something we just don't see enough in Sacramento. And hopefully maybe if we're gonna try that again, and I'm sure someone will try that again, like it's gonna happen. It's just a matter of when, just like repealing Costa-Hawkins. Hopefully we can kind of start with that broad table and build something together out of that.
And I just, I was going to add, I mean, both Shanti and Pedro was so eloquent in terms of how they kind of framed this. And I think my feelings on this get very raw, because in some levels, I think that we have to just realize that, there are things that are impacting communities of color that are real. Like gentrification is a real thing that impacts communities of color. And so when you talk about community groups that use things like CEQA and, protect communities. Yeah, there are definitely people who use it who want to just protect exclusionary communities, but there are folks who also do it because they want to protect their working class neighborhoods. And so I think acknowledging that people are using different tools in our current systems to protect their communities, and some of them are coming from good places in terms of wanting to make sure that we don't have constant displacement that pushes people from San Francisco to Oakland, Oakland to Antioch to Fresno. Like that is very destabilizing for a working class family to be moving every few years from one community to another. And so I can't say enough about what Pedro and Shanti have just said about just making sure folks are at the table and not assume that folks are coming something as being anti-housing. I think there's actually a lot of alignment that we need more housing. Of course, our focus, many of us focus on affordable housing, but I think there is acknowledgement we need more housing. But there has been a historic thing, especially me coming out of Oakland, that a lot of the we've met our goals in market rate housing, but we haven't met any of our goals when it comes to affordable housing production for low income or even moderate or middle income people. And so I think that there's a piece of it that whatever happens in restarting these conversations, you have some great folks here at the table like Shanti and Pedro, and to make sure that they're involved, right? Because they know what it means to talk about sensitive communities and to protect folks. And they know what it means to not have an unintended consequence of having renters displaced, right? Because some bills might have really good intentions and then have completely other consequences. And I think that's what is really important to look at. Any other thoughts on this? If not, I'm going to move to the next question. Okay, the next question is actually just a comment assembly member about the social housing, and just wondering, what kind of connection there is in terms of like with the feds, just because of the sheer number of federal funding it might need to take to make this bill happen. And they're just wondering about communication with Congress.
I'm definitely hopeful that we'll be supported by federal efforts and federal funding, but after perhaps the last decade, I don't put our hopes in the federal government anymore, and I'm trying to do it our own way as much as we can. So it's definitely something we're open to, but I mean, look, it's still, results start to be seen if the federal government can produce anymore, but yeah, it's a short answer.
And we only have 4 minutes left. And I realize I see Susie asked about AB 71. We did send a response via chat, because I think it was the first question we got, and then we sent a document. But if there are any questions, I did want to share that Shanti, Pedro, and myself are willing to answer questions directly to make sure if we left anything out that folks know about it. And so if you have questions for us, feel free to contact us. Here is our contact information right here. And in addition, you should also have a Google Doc. If you want to get on any of our newsletters or get more information, feel free to join, to fill out the Google Doc, and we'll keep you posted on things that we're working on, or if you want to dialogue about things that you're working on. As was said before, getting that organizing and getting those letters into the state is really key and pertinent, especially during the pandemic. So we're going to we have 3 minutes left. So I was going to just also offer the opportunity to have folks maybe do, a quick closing statement, if that would be okay with everybody. So why don't we start off with Shanti? Do you want to start off with some closing thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I feel excited by this conversation, and I'm generally excited. Like a lot of what's been going on has just been incredibly depressing. But I think that there is an attitude that we're kind of running into as progressives and as socialists, in the state level, where it's like, we can't do anything ambitious because there's a pandemic. How dare you do something ambitious because there's a pandemic going on? Like, don't you know that there's a pandemic going on? Like, we can't try anything, which is, I'm really glad, like, there's clearly a critical mass of people who are basically saying, no, this is the exact time to try ambitious things. So I'm definitely coming away from this conversation with that. I'm very excited to move forward. And please contact me if you have any questions about anything.
Pedro, any thoughts?
I totally agree with Shanti. It is a time to do ambitious things. It's not a time to retract. And I want to build on what Assemblymember Lee said earlier, because organizing and coming to your elected officials really does make a difference. We are involved in organizing meetings with faith leaders, our members, with legislators from across the state, just to emphasize the importance of continuing to build affordable housing in their districts. And they remember it matters. And so please do fill out the Google form that Bobbi sent out. Be involved. Happy to plug you in on any of the work that we're doing. And even if it's not work that we're doing, happy to connect you to other people doing other work that interests you. It's absolutely critical, and we need your pressure to keep building a more just California.
Assemblymember, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I can't agree more. Now is the time to do ambitious big things, because now is what, now we need it. We need those big changes. And it's so important, everyone that's on this call and listening right now, the work you do in housing justice, is I still maintain that housing is the one way every single Californian experiences the vast inequality in California. Whether you have it or you don't have housing, whether you're paying a fraction of the property taxes to your neighbor, or you're paying, of course, 10 times more than you are, whether your rent goes up 10 times faster than your salary goes up, all of that is the way you're experiencing it right now, because how we use our land, how we've commodified it, is so ingrained with the system of hyper-capitalization we've done in everything, or hyper-capitalization of everything. So it's really important to be organized and stay that way. I'm a legislator that will always listen to the tenant groups and tenant justice groups, because I feel, frankly, that we're often not getting your due day and, how does the phrase go, your day in court, essentially, and not being listened to enough. And that's reflective in some other proposals we had in the past, right? So making sure that your opinions are heard, making sure you're finding allies is so important, because we need to make sure that tenants who have everything to lose and everything everything at stake are at the decision-making table, and I'm going to work so hard to keep doing that and make sure that housing justice is a priority for everyone. So really glad to be in the fight together with everyone, and hope to be working all with you soon and see you even in person soon at some point. So.
Thank you. Jane, any thoughts? No pressure, but you always have great ideas and kind of. Well, then I will say a few words just real quick. Thank you guys all for joining us on this panel. We tried to get all of the questions. Obviously, we weren't able to, but we will be sending out the PowerPoint, which has our contact information. Feel free to continue to dialogue with any of us. Thank you again to Assemblymember Lee for being here, Jane Kim for all your work on this, Council Member Fife and Shanti and Pedro for all of your work in policy and organizing to push forward affordable housing and tenants' rights. And again, I just want to say we're going to send the information out. Consider this part of a dialogue. There was so much dialogue happening in the California Progressive Alliance thread. I don't know if I caught everything, but we'd love to continue the dialogue so that we can answer everybody's questions and just build more relationships with each other, especially during the pandemic. And yes, to universal broadband. I think that intersectionality of whether it's clean money campaign to broadband, all of it connects to creating a more just California. Jane, do you want to say a few words?
The only thing I was just going to say is just thank you to all the panelists, but also, our movement is only going to be successful if it looks like California. And something that I love about this panel is that it really reflects the communities that we are organizing and working to strengthen across the state.
Great. Well, thank you everybody for joining us. Really appreciate it. Have a good afternoon.